The silence stretched across the desert like a death shroud, broken only by the distant thrum of rotor blades cutting through the scorched air. Major Kira, Reaper, Volkov crouched behind the twisted wreckage of what had once been a state-of-the-art F-22 Raptor, her fingers tracing the skull and crossbones patch sewn into her flight suit's left shoulder. The patch told a story most would never believe: 13 confirmed kills in aerial combat, each one earned in circumstances that defied conventional military doctrine. The approaching helicopters grew louder, their mechanical heartbeat echoing off the canyon walls. 3 U-60 Blackhawks, flying in perfect formation, their olive-drab hulls gleaming in the harsh Afghan sun. Kira's breath caught as she recognized the tactical approach, a standard search and rescue pattern, but executed with the precision of hunters closing in on wounded prey. Through her cracked helmet visor, she watched the lead helicopter's pilot lean forward in his seat, scanning the crash site below. The radio crackled with static-filled chatter, words she couldn't quite make out but whose urgency needed no translation. They were looking for survivors. They were looking for her. But something was wrong. The helicopters had maintained their approach vector for exactly 93 seconds. She'd been counting, a habit from her test pilot days, when suddenly, inexplicably, they stopped. The lead Black Hawk's nose dipped slightly, as if the pilot had spotted something that made him reconsider his entire mission profile. Kira pressed herself deeper into the shadow of the wreckage, her heart hammering against her ribs. The patch on her shoulder seemed to burn through the fabric, its grim symbolism suddenly feeling less like a badge of honor and more like a target painted on her chest. She'd earned every stitch of that emblem through blood and determination, proving herself in a world that had spent years trying to convince her she didn't belong. The helicopters hung in the air like predatory birds, their rotors creating dust devils that danced across the barren landscape. She could see the door gunners now, their weapons trained on the crash site, fingers hovering over triggers. But still, they didn't advance. Still, they held their position as if paralyzed by some invisible force. In the growing silence, Kira realized that her reputation had preceded her. The Reaper patch wasn't just decoration. It was a warning, a testament to skills that had made her a legend whispered about in ready rooms and briefing tents across 3 continents. Now, faced with the reality of that legend, even seasoned combat veterans were having second thoughts. Captain Marcus Sledge Rodriguez keyed his radio from the lead Black Hawk's pilot seat, his voice tight with uncertainty. "Control, this is Rescue 1. We have eyes on the crash site, requesting confirmation on survivor identification." The response came back crackling with static. "Rescue 1, survivor is Major Kira Volkov, Coulson Reaper, priority Alpha extraction." Sledge's co-pilot, Lieutenant James Torch Mitchell, leaned over and tapped the intelligence brief clipped to his knee board. "Boss, you seeing what I'm seeing down there?" Through his aviator sunglasses, Sledge squinted at the wreckage below. The F-22 had pancaked into the desert floor, its stealth coating scorched black by the impact explosion. But there, moving slightly in the shade of the twisted fuselage, was a figure in a flight suit. Even from 300 feet up, the skull and crossbones patch on her shoulder was unmistakable. "Jesus Christ," Sledge whispered, "it's really her." The legend of Reaper had spread through military aviation circles like wildfire. They said she could thread a needle with a Sidewinder missile, that she'd once taken down 3 MiGs with a damaged flight control system, that she'd survived a mid-air collision by sheer force of will. Most dismissed the stories as barroom mythology, the kind of tall tales that grew in the telling. But the patch didn't lie. 13 kills, each one documented, verified, and sealed in classified files that most officers would never see. The skull grinned up at them from the desert floor, a reminder that death had a name, a face, and a service record that read like something out of a fever dream. "Rescue 2, Rescue 3, maintain overwatch," Sledge ordered. "I'm taking us down." But even as he spoke the words, his hands hesitated on the controls. Below them, Kira Volkov remained motionless, calculating. The woman who'd earned the right to wear that patch had survived worse than a helicopter crash. She'd survived a system that had tried to break her, colleagues who tried to bury her, and enemies who tried to kill her. The Blackhawk descended slowly, its pilot fighting every instinct that told him to stay clear of the legend waiting in the wreckage below. Kira watched the helicopters descend with the calculating eye of a predator. Her survival training had kicked in the moment she'd pulled herself from the burning cockpit, but this was different. This wasn't about evading enemy forces or navigating hostile territory. This was about managing a reputation that had grown beyond her control. The crash had been mechanical failure, pure and simple. A hydraulic line had burst at 30,000 feet, sending her Raptor into an uncontrolled spin. She'd fought the aircraft for 6 minutes, wrestling with dead controls and screaming alarms, before finally ejecting at the last possible second. The parachute had deployed properly, but the landing had been hard, leaving her with a twisted ankle and a gash across her forehead that had painted her helmet visor with blood. But she was alive, she was functional, and she was watching 3 helicopters full of American servicemen approach her position with the kind of caution usually reserved for unexploded ordnance. The irony wasn't lost on her. 6 years ago, when she'd first arrived at her squadron, the same men who now flew with reverent fear had treated her like a novelty act. A woman in a fighter cockpit was still enough of a rarity to draw stares and whispered conversations. They'd called her Princess then, a diminutive that had stung more than any physical wound. But Princess had died somewhere over the Hindu Kush, replaced by something harder, more focused. The first kill had been defensive, a Taliban fighter who'd gotten lucky with a surface-to-air missile. The second had been retribution. By the time she'd reached her 13th confirmed kill, Princess was just a memory, replaced by a call sign that made grown men uncomfortable. The lead Black Hawk touched down 50 meters away, its rotors still spinning, ready for immediate departure. Kira could see the crew chief in the doorway, his weapon lowered but ready. Behind him, a flight medic waited with a stretcher and medical kit. She stood slowly, deliberately, letting them see her clearly. The skull and crossbones patch caught the sunlight as she raised her hands, showing them she was unarmed. But even that simple gesture carried weight. These were her hands, after all, the same hands that had guided missiles into enemy aircraft, that had danced across controls with deadly precision. "I'm okay," she called out, her voice carrying across the desert floor. "Just need a ride home." The crew chief hesitated, his eyes locked on the patch. He'd heard the stories like everyone else, but seeing her there, bloodied and standing in the wreckage of her aircraft, transformed legend into reality. This was the woman who'd single-handedly turned the tide of 3 separate engagements, who'd earned a reputation that preceded her into every briefing room and ready tent. Sledge's voice crackled through his headset. "Bring her aboard, Chief. Nice and easy." The crew chief nodded, stepping down from the helicopter. As he approached, Kira noticed his nameplate read Johnson, and his rank insignia marked him as a staff sergeant. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of earnest face that belonged in a recruiting poster. "Ma'am," he said, his voice respectful, "we're here to get you out." Kira nodded, limping slightly as she walked toward the helicopter. With each step, she felt the weight of their stares, the burden of a reputation that had been built one engagement at a time. The patch on her shoulder had become more than decoration. It was a symbol of everything she'd endured, everything she'd overcome, everything she'd proven. As she climbed into the Black Hawk's cargo compartment, she caught sight of the crew's faces. Gone was the casual dismissal she'd once known. Instead, she saw something she'd never expected to earn: respect born of fear, admiration tempered by caution. The helicopter lifted off, banking away from the crash site. Below them, the wreckage of her F-22 grew smaller, another chapter in a story that had started with doubt and evolved into legend. But Kira knew the truth behind the patch, behind the call sign, behind the reputation that had made 3 helicopters hesitate before approaching her position. She was just a pilot who refused to quit. Torch leaned back from the co-pilot's seat, his voice barely audible over the rotor noise. "Control, this is Rescue 1. Package secured. One survivor uninjured, requesting immediate transport to Bagram." The response came back immediately. "Rescue 1 copy. Priority routing approved. Clear to Bagram direct." But there was something else in the controller's voice, a note of recognition that suggested word had already spread. By the time they landed, half the base would know that Reaper was coming home. The other half would learn soon enough. Kira settled back in the canvas seat, her helmet cradled in her lap. The skull and crossbones patch stared up at her, its empty eye sockets seeming to wink in the changing light. She'd earned every thread of that emblem through skill, determination, and a willingness to face death on its own terms. The helicopters flew in formation toward the base, their precious cargo more valuable than any intelligence asset or strategic weapon. They carried a living legend, a woman who'd proven that courage had no gender, that skill recognized no boundaries, that death itself could be conquered by those willing to meet it head-on. Johnson, the crew chief, found himself stealing glances at her throughout the flight. He'd joined the military straight out of high school, driven by dreams of adventure and service. But sitting 3 feet away from a genuine war hero, he realized that his understanding of both concepts had been hopelessly naive. The woman across from him had faced enemy fire 13 times and emerged victorious. She'd climbed into a cockpit every day knowing that each mission might be her last, yet she'd never faltered. The patch on her shoulder wasn't just decoration. It was a testament to a kind of courage that existed beyond the reach of ordinary mortals. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice barely audible above the engine noise, "it's an honor to fly with you." Kira looked up, surprised by the genuine respect in his voice. Throughout her career, she'd grown accustomed to skepticism, to the constant need to prove herself worthy of the trust placed in her. But here, in the cargo hold of a rescue helicopter, she saw something different in the young sergeant's eyes. "Just doing my job," she replied, but even as she spoke the words, she knew they were inadequate. Her job had evolved beyond simple mission parameters, beyond the neat boundaries of military doctrine. She'd become something more complex, more dangerous, more necessary. The helicopter banked left, following the river valley toward Bagram. Below them, the Afghan landscape stretched endlessly, a patchwork of ancient villages and modern warfare. This was the theater where she'd earned her reputation, where Princess had died and Reaper had been born. Sledge's voice crackled through the intercom. "ETA 15 minutes, medical team standing by." Kira almost laughed. Medical team. As if her injuries were the real concern. The twisted ankle would heal in a week, the forehead gash would leave a barely visible scar. But the psychological weight of her reputation, the burden of being a living legend, would follow her for the rest of her career. The other crew members kept stealing glances at her, their eyes inevitably drawn to the patch on her shoulder. She'd grown accustomed to the attention, but it still felt surreal. 6 years ago, she'd been fighting for basic acceptance, struggling to prove she belonged in a cockpit. Now, seasoned veterans looked at her with something approaching awe. The transformation hadn't been easy. Every kill had been earned through skill and determination, but also through a willingness to embrace the darkness that came with taking lives. The patch had started as a joke, a way to cope with the psychological weight of her first confirmed kill. But somewhere along the way, it had become something more, a symbol of her refusal to be broken by a system that had never wanted her to succeed. The helicopters began their descent toward Bagram, the sprawling base growing larger as they approached. Kira could see the runway, the hangar complexes, the administrative buildings that housed the machinery of modern warfare. Somewhere down there, officers were already preparing reports, Investigators were organizing crash site analysis, and intelligence officers were updating her service record. But none of that mattered as much as the simple fact that she was alive, that she'd survived another day in a war that had claimed so many others. The patch on her shoulder had become her armor, her identity, her proof that she'd earned the right to wear it. As the Blackhawk touched down, she caught sight of the crowd gathered near the landing zone. Word had spread quickly, as it always did on military bases. They'd come to see the legend, to witness the return of the pilot who'd made death itself seem conquerable. Johnson helped her down from the helicopter, his hands steady and respectful. "Ma'am, it's been an honor." She nodded, accepting the sentiment with the grace of someone who'd learned to carry the weight of other people's expectations. The skull and crossbones patch caught the afternoon sun as she walked toward the waiting medical team, its grim symbolism somehow transformed into something almost beautiful. Behind her, the helicopter crew watched her go with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious figures or historical icons. They'd participated in something significant, something that would be discussed in ready rooms and briefing tents for years to come. They'd rescued not just a pilot, but a living embodiment of everything the military claimed to represent: courage, skill, and an unbreakable determination to complete the mission. The medical team approached with professional efficiency, but even they seemed awed by her presence. Dr. Sarah Chen, the base's chief flight surgeon, had treated hundreds of combat injuries, but she'd never worked on someone whose reputation preceded them quite so dramatically. "Major Volkov," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "let's get you checked out." Kira nodded, allowing herself to be led toward the medical facility. As they walked, she became aware of the crowd that had gathered to watch her return. Pilots, mechanics, support staff, all drawn by the magnetic pull of legend made manifest. They stared at the patch on her shoulder with the kind of fascination usually reserved for religious artifacts. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years fighting for acceptance, for the right to be judged by her skills rather than her gender. Now, she'd achieved something beyond acceptance. She'd become a symbol, a representation of everything that was possible when determination met opportunity. But symbols were dangerous things. They created expectations that real people couldn't always meet, standards that existed beyond the reach of human frailty. The patch on her shoulder had become her identity, but it had also become her prison. As the medical team began their examination, Kira found herself thinking about the crash, about the 6 minutes she'd spent fighting for control of a dying aircraft. In those moments, she hadn't been a legend or a symbol. She'd been a pilot doing her job, using every skill she'd acquired to stay alive. That, she realized, was the truth behind the patch. Not the mythology that had grown around her, not the stories that had been embellished with each telling, but the simple reality of a woman who'd refused to accept limitation as destiny. The examination was thorough but brief. Twisted ankle, minor concussion, superficial lacerations. Nothing that would ground her for more than a week. But Kira knew the real evaluation would come later, when the accident investigators finished their work and the review board decided whether she'd return to flight status. Dr. Chen finished her notes and looked up. "You're remarkably intact for someone who just survived a high-speed ejection. Your physical conditioning probably saved your life." Kira almost smiled. Physical conditioning. As if surviving 13 air-to-air engagements had been a matter of gymnasium workouts and proper nutrition. The truth was more complex, more personal. She'd survived because she'd learned to embrace the darkness, to find strength in the places where others found only fear. "When can I fly again?" she asked. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone in the room knew her reputation, knew that grounding Reaper was like caging a wild animal. She wasn't built for desk work or administrative assignments. She was built for the cockpit, for the split-second decisions that separated life from death. "Depends on the investigation," Dr. Chen replied carefully. But physically, you should be cleared within the week. Kira nodded, accepting the answer even as she began planning her return to flight status. The patch on her shoulder had been earned through action, not medical evaluations. She'd prove herself worthy of it again, just as she'd proven herself worthy of everything else she'd achieved. As the medical team finished their work, she became aware of a presence at the door. Colonel James "Hawk" Harrison, the base commander, stood watching with the kind of expression usually reserved for natural disasters or visiting dignitaries. He'd been a pilot himself once, before climbing the administrative ladder that led to command positions. "Major Volkov," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "we need to talk." Kira stood, her movements carefully controlled despite the pain in her ankle. She'd dealt with commanders before, men who saw her reputation as either an asset to be exploited or a liability to be managed. Harrison's expression suggested he hadn't decided which category she fell into. "Sir," she replied, her voice neutral. Harrison gestured toward the door. "My office, 5 minutes." As he left, Kira caught sight of her reflection in the medical facility's polished steel cabinet. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who'd climbed into the F-22 that morning. The crash had marked her, but not in the way she'd expected. Instead of diminishing her, it had somehow solidified her legend. The skull and crossbones patch seemed to pulse with its own life, a reminder of everything she'd overcome and everything she'd yet to face. She'd earned the right to wear it through blood and determination, and she'd defend that right with everything she had. The walk to Harrison's office felt like a journey through a gauntlet of stairs and whispered conversations. Every person she passed seemed to recognize her, to understand the significance of her presence. The patch on her shoulder had become a beacon, drawing attention like a lighthouse in a storm. Harrison's office was spartanly decorated, with the kind of military efficiency that suggested a man who'd learned to value function over form. The walls were lined with photographs from his flying days, reminders of a time when his concerns had been measured in altitude and airspeed rather than budgets and personnel reports. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Kira remained standing, her posture military perfect despite the pain in her ankle. "I prefer to stand, sir." Harrison studied her for a long moment, his eyes inevitably drawn to the patch on her shoulder. Like everyone else, he'd heard the stories. Unlike everyone else, he'd seen her service record, had access to the classified files that documented every engagement, every kill, every moment of controlled violence that had earned her the right to wear that grim symbol. "You're a problem, Major," he said finally. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Kira had heard similar statements before, from officers who saw her success as a threat to their understanding of how the military was supposed to work. But Harrison's tone was different, more thoughtful than hostile. "How so, sir?" Harrison leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You've become larger than the mission. Your reputation precedes you into every briefing room, every ready tent, every combat zone we deploy you to. The enemy knows your name, your call sign, your kill count. You've become a symbol." Kira felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd feared this conversation for years, had known it would come eventually. Success in the military was acceptable, even encouraged. But becoming a legend was dangerous, unpredictable, hard to control. "I'm just a pilot doing my job, sir." Harrison's laugh was bitter. "Just a pilot. Major, you have 13 confirmed kills in air-to-air combat. You've single-handedly shifted the balance of power in 3 separate theaters. Intelligence reports suggest the enemy has placed a bounty on your head that exceeds most small nation military budgets. You are not just a pilot." The truth of his words settled over her like a weight. She'd spent so long focused on proving herself worthy of the patch, worthy of the call sign, worthy of the respect of her peers, that she'd lost sight of what she'd become. She wasn't just Kira Volkov anymore. She was Reaper, a legend that existed beyond the boundaries of any single person. "What are you saying, sir?" Harrison stood, moving to the window that overlooked the flight line. Below them, aircraft sat in neat rows, their weapons systems gleaming in the afternoon sun. Each one represented millions of dollars in taxpayer investment, thousands of hours of training, countless resources devoted to the projection of American power. "I'm saying that you've become too valuable to risk and too dangerous to ignore. The Pentagon wants you stateside, training the next generation of pilots. The CIA wants you for special operations that exist beyond the reach of conventional military doctrine. The State Department wants you retired before you create an international incident that requires diplomatic solutions." Kira felt her world shifting, the ground beneath her feet becoming uncertain. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd achieved, was being threatened by the very success that had earned her the patch on her shoulder. "And what do you want, sir?" Harrison turned back to face her, his expression grave. "I want you to keep flying, but I need you to understand that your next mission might be your last. The enemy isn't just hunting you because you're effective. They're hunting you because you've become a symbol of everything they're fighting against." The words hit her like a physical blow. She'd always known that combat flying was dangerous, that each mission carried the risk of death. But she'd never considered that her success might make her a target beyond the usual parameters of warfare. "Are you grounding me, sir?" Harrison's smile was sad. "I couldn't ground you if I wanted to. You've become too important, too necessary. But I need you to understand that the woman who climbed into that F-22 this morning was different from the one who ejected from it. The crash has made you more than just a pilot. It's made you a story." Kira thought about the crew chief's words, about the respect she'd seen in his eyes. She'd worked so hard to earn that respect, to prove herself worthy of it. But now she understood that respect came with a price, that legends were expected to be more than human. "What happens now?" Harrison returned to his desk, opening a folder that contained her service record. The pages were thick with commendations, awards, and classified notations that documented her transformation from princess to reaper. "Now you heal. Now you prepare for whatever comes next. And now you decide whether you want to be remembered as the pilot who earned 13 kills, or as the legend who proved that courage has no gender." The choice, Kira realized, had been made years ago. The moment she'd accepted the call sign Reaper, the moment she'd sewn the skull and crossbones patch onto her flight suit, she'd chosen to become something more than just a pilot. She'd chosen to become a symbol. The question now was whether she was strong enough to carry that burden. As she left Harrison's office, Kira found herself thinking about the young crew chief who'd helped her from the helicopter. His eyes had held something she'd never seen before, not just respect, but hope. He'd looked at her patch and seen proof that the impossible was possible, that determination could overcome any obstacle. That, she realized, was the real weight of the symbol she wore. It wasn't just about her achievements, her kills, her survival. It was about everyone who looked at her and saw evidence that their own dreams might be achievable. The sun was setting over Bagram as she made her way to the temporary quarters Harrison had arranged. The base was winding down for the evening, but she could feel the attention that followed her movements. Word of her survival had spread through the complex like wildfire, and everyone wanted to see the legend who'd cheated death once again. The quarters were standard military issue: a narrow bed, a small desk, and a wall locker that contained her personal effects. But as she unpacked her gear, she found herself focusing on the spare flight suit hanging in the locker. The skull and crossbones patch was sewn into the shoulder with military precision, its threads strong enough to survive years of use. She'd earned that patch through blood and determination, through a willingness to face death on its own terms. But now, she understood that wearing it meant accepting responsibility for everyone who looked at it and saw hope. The night was quiet, but Kira found sleep elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the Blackhawks hesitating in their approach, saw the crew chief's respectful expression, felt the weight of Harrison's words. She'd become something more than a pilot, something more than a person. She'd become a symbol of everything that was possible when courage met opportunity. The skull and crossbones patch lay on her bedside table, its empty eye socket seeming to watch her in the darkness. Tomorrow, she'd put it on again, would wear it with the pride of someone who'd earned every thread. But tonight, she allowed herself to remember the woman who'd first sewn it onto her flight suit, the woman who'd been searching for an identity in a world that seemed determined to deny her one. That woman had been afraid, uncertain, desperate to prove herself worthy of the trust placed in her. But she'd found strength in the darkness, had learned to embrace the part of herself that others feared. The patch had become her armor, her identity, her proof that she belonged in a cockpit. Now, as she drifted toward sleep, Kira understood that the real power of the symbol wasn't in what it represented about her. It was in what it represented about everyone who wore the uniform, everyone who climbed into a cockpit, everyone who faced death with courage and determination. The patch was more than decoration. It was a promise that courage could be learned, that legends could be made, that death itself could be conquered by those willing to meet it head-on. And tomorrow she'd prove it all over again. The morning came too soon, accompanied by the familiar sounds of a military base coming to life. Kira woke with the sunrise, her internal clock calibrated to the rhythms of combat operations. The ankle felt better, the concussion had faded, and the gash on her forehead had sealed into a thin red line that would soon be just another scar. But as she reached for her flight suit, she hesitated. The skull and crossbones patch seemed heavier than usual, weighted with the knowledge of what it meant to everyone who saw it. She'd earned the right to wear it, but she'd also accepted the responsibility that came with it. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Major Volkov, Colonel Harrison wants to see you in the briefing room." Kira finished dressing quickly, ensuring that every detail of her appearance met military standards. The patch was perfectly positioned, its grim symbolism a stark contrast to the olive-drab fabric of her flight suit. She'd worn it through 13 engagements, through countless training flights, through the crash that had nearly ended her career. The briefing room was filled with familiar faces, squadron commanders, intelligence officers, and the kind of senior personnel who dealt with problems that existed beyond the reach of standard military doctrine. At the center of the room, a large screen displayed satellite imagery of the crash site, the wreckage of her F-22 clearly visible against the desert floor. Harrison stood at the podium, his expression grave. "Ladies and gentlemen, yesterday's aircraft loss represents more than just a mechanical failure. It represents a shift in how we approach air superiority in this theater." The presentation that followed was clinical in its precision. Every detail of the crash had been analyzed, every system failure documented, every decision she'd made evaluated by experts who'd never faced the reality of a dying aircraft. But Kira listened with the detached attention of someone who'd lived through the experience, who knew that reports could never capture the full truth of those 6 minutes. "The pilot's actions during the emergency were exemplary," Harrison continued. "She maintained control of the aircraft for nearly 6 minutes after the initial hydraulic failure, allowing time for search and rescue assets to track her position. Her decision to eject at the last possible moment likely saved her life." Kira felt the weight of their stares, the burden of being evaluated by people who saw her as either an asset or a liability. The patch on her shoulder had become a focal point, drawing attention like a magnet. But she'd learned to carry that attention with the grace of someone who'd earned the right to wear it. "However," Harrison's voice carried a note of caution, "the loss of the aircraft represents a significant tactical setback. The F-22 was equipped with advanced avionics and weapons systems that are now in enemy hands. Recovery operations are underway, but we must assume that sensitive technology has been compromised. The implications hung in the air like a challenge. Kira had survived the crash, but her aircraft hadn't. Somewhere in the Afghan desert, enemy forces were probably already sifting through the wreckage, looking for intelligence that could shift the balance of power in the region. Major Volkov, Harrison's voice cut through her thoughts. Do you have anything to add? She stood, her movements precise despite the lingering pain in her ankle. Every eye in the room was focused on her, on the patch that had become her identity, on the reputation that had made her both valuable and dangerous. The aircraft performed as designed until the hydraulic failure, she said, her voice steady. The emergency procedures were followed correctly. The ejection system functioned properly. I have no recommendations for procedural changes. It was a careful answer, professionally neutral and technically accurate. But everyone in the room knew there was more to the story, more complexity to the woman who'd earned the right to wear the skull and crossbones patch. Thank you, Major, you're dismissed. As she left the briefing room, Kira caught sight of the intelligence officer who'd been taking notes throughout the presentation. Captain David Spook Thompson was known for his analytical mind and his ability to see patterns that others missed. He'd been watching her with the kind of intensity that suggested he understood the significance of what had happened. Major Volkov, he called out as she reached the door. A word. She paused, turning to face him. Thompson was young for his rank, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that marked him as someone who'd risen through merit rather than politics. What can I do for you, Captain? Thompson glanced around the corridor, ensuring they were alone. I've been tracking enemy communications since your crash. They're not just celebrating the loss of an F-22. They're celebrating the fact that they almost got Reaper. The words hit her like a physical blow. She'd known her reputation had spread beyond American forces, but she'd never fully grasped the extent to which she'd become a target. The patch on her shoulder wasn't just a symbol of her achievements. It was a bullseye painted on her chest. What are you saying, Captain? Thompson's expression was grave. I'm saying that you've become a strategic objective. The enemy isn't just trying to shoot down American aircraft anymore. They're specifically hunting you. The corridor seemed to spin around her as the implications sank in. Every mission, every flight, every moment she spent in a cockpit wasn't just about completing objectives or supporting ground forces. It was about surviving targeted assassination attempts by an enemy that had marked her for death. Have you shared this with Colonel Harrison? Thompson nodded. He's aware, but he wanted you to hear it from me to understand the full scope of what you're facing. Kira felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. The woman who'd climbed into that F-22 the previous morning had been just another pilot. The woman standing in the corridor was something else entirely. A target, a symbol, a legend that existed beyond the boundaries of any single person. What happens now? Thompson's smile was bitter. Now you decide whether you want to keep flying, knowing that every mission is essentially a suicide run, or you accept reassignment to a desk job and spend the rest of your career wondering what might have been. The choice, Kira realized, had been made years ago. The moment she'd accepted the Callsign Reaper, the moment she'd sewn the skull and crossbones patch onto her flight suit, she'd chosen to become something more than just a pilot. She'd chosen to become a symbol. And symbols, she was learning, were expected to be immortal. As Thompson walked away, Kira found herself alone in the corridor, surrounded by the familiar sounds of a military base in operation. But everything felt different now, weighted with the knowledge that she'd become something beyond her control. The patch on her shoulder seemed to pulse with its own life, a reminder of everything she'd achieved and everything she'd yet to face. She'd earned the right to wear it through blood and determination, through a willingness to face death on its own terms. Now she was learning that death was hunting her with the same determination, she'd once brought to hunting the enemy. The rest of the day passed in a blur of medical evaluations, administrative procedures, and the kind of routine bureaucracy that followed any significant incident. But throughout it all, Kira was aware of the attention that followed her movements, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the weight of being a living legend. The patch on her shoulder had become more than decoration. It had become her identity, her burden, her proof that she'd earned the right to wear it. But it had also become a target, a symbol that marked her for death by an enemy that understood the power of killing legends. As evening,